The corridor outside the executive vault had one rule that every employee at the Palm Resort knew by heart. Nobody walked it without a badge, an escort, or Dominic Vane's direct word. So when Dominic rounded the corner that morning and saw a woman in a housekeeping apron standing there, running her fingers along the edge of a locked cart, his first thought wasn't suspicion. It was mild irritation. Some poor new hire had gotten turned around on her first week. She was on the heavier side, soft through the shoulders, with dark hair pulled back in a low knot that had already started slipping loose. Her apron was folded crisp at the waist, and she held a stack of white linens against her chest like she'd been caught mid-errand. When she noticed him, she didn't flinch the way most staff did. She just looked at him, calm, almost curious, like she was the one deciding whether he belonged there. "This floor's restricted," Dominic said, keeping his voice even. He was used to people going quiet around him, used to the way his name moved through a room before he did. "Housekeeping doesn't come past the second checkpoint. Who sent you up here?" "I was told the linen closet on this floor needed restocking," she said. Her voice was steady, almost too steady for someone who'd just wandered into the most guarded hallway in his building. Dominic didn't buy it. He'd built this resort from a failing beachfront property into the crown piece of his hospitality holdings, and he knew every inch of it, including which linen closets existed and which didn't. There wasn't one on this floor. There'd never been one. He stepped closer, close enough to catch the tag pinned crooked on her apron, half hidden under the fold of fabric. He reached out, more out of habit than anything, meaning to turn her toward the elevator and have security walk her out quietly. No scene, no fuss. His fingers had barely brushed her sleeve when his eyes dropped to the tag and actually read it. Special Investigator Evelyn Vance, Federal Financial Crimes Division. His hand stopped moving. For a second, the hallway seemed to tilt slightly, like the floor had shifted under a building he thought was solid ground. "You're not housekeeping," he said slowly. "No," Evelyn agreed. She didn't look away from him, and she didn't look afraid either, which unsettled him more than if she had. "I'm not." He let go of her sleeve like it had gone hot. His mind ran fast through everything the last 5 minutes could mean, how long she'd been on this floor, what she'd already seen, whether the cart she'd been standing next to held anything that mattered. He kept his face still. Whatever she was here for, she wasn't going to read it off him. "Federal," he repeated, testing the word out loud, like saying it might make it less true. "You walked into my resort in a maid's apron." "I did." She set the folded linens down on the cart, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world, and he was the one running short on it. "It's easier to see how a place really runs when nobody thinks you're watching. People don't perform for the cleaning staff, Mr. Vane. They perform for men like you." That landed somewhere he didn't like. Dominic had spent 6 years making sure his name meant something clean in this city. Jobs for people who needed them, contracts that actually paid on time, a resort that brought tourists and tax revenue instead of trouble. He'd fought hard to keep the parts of his world that weren't clean far away from the parts that were. Hearing a federal investigator say his own hallway had been performing for him felt like being told his house had a room he'd never noticed. "You have a warrant," he said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a folded document, holding it out without ceremony. "For financial records. Transport ledgers, vendor contracts, offshore transfers tied to this property and its parent company. I'd have shown you this properly, through your legal team, except I wanted one morning to see the place before everyone knew to be careful." Dominic didn't take the paper. He didn't need to. He already knew what it would say, and knowing it didn't scare him the way she probably expected. What scared him, if he was honest with himself, was the possibility that she'd find something he didn't know was there. He ran a tight operation. He believed that. But belief and certainty weren't the same thing, and something in the calm, unbothered way she stood in his hallway told him she already suspected the gap between them. "Put the paper away," he said finally. "You don't need it. Come to my office. I'll open every ledger you want to see." Something shifted in her expression, brief and hard to name, Surprise, maybe, that he hadn't called security, hadn't threatened her, hadn't done any of the things men in his position were supposed to do when a federal agent walked uninvited into their most private hallway. She studied him a moment longer, like she was recalculating something. "That's not what I expected you to say," she admitted. "Get used to it," Dominic said, already turning toward the elevator. "You're going to find out I'm not what you expected, period." She followed him without a word, but he could feel her watching the back of his head the whole walk down, cataloguing him the way she'd probably been trained to catalogue everything. He didn't know yet how much that morning would cost him, or how much it would end up giving him back. He only knew that the woman in the apron had just walked into his life, carrying a warrant in one hand and, without meaning to, a question he couldn't yet answer in the other. How well did he really know the people running his own company? Dominic's office sat on the top floor, glass walls overlooking the marina, the kind of view most people needed a reservation to see. Evelyn had changed out of the apron by the time she reached it, dressed now in a plain blazer she must have kept folded in a bag somewhere, though she hadn't bothered changing her shoes. Practical. He noticed things like that. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. He didn't sit himself right away. He walked to the cabinet behind him, pulled out 3 thick binders, and set them down in front of her with a weight that made the desk creak. "Payroll, vendor contracts, transport logs for the last 2 years. You want more? Tell me, and I'll have it pulled." Evelyn looked at the binders, then at him, like she was recalculating him for the second time that day. "Most people in your position ask for a lawyer before they ask what I need. Most people in my position have something to hide from a lawyer's questions, too." He finally sat, leaning back, watching her open the first binder without any hesitation, like she'd been waiting all morning for exactly this. "I don't. Or I don't think I do. You're about to tell me which one it is." She didn't answer that directly. She was already scanning columns, her finger moving down a page of numbers with a speed that told him she'd read 1,000 ledgers just like it. He'd expected a slower process, more questions, more back and forth. Instead, she worked in near silence, occasionally circling something with a pencil she'd produced from her blazer pocket, never once looking up to gauge his reaction. "You run a tight ship," she said eventually, not looking up. "Cleaner than most properties I've audited. That's not a compliment, for the record. It's an observation." "I'll take it as one anyway." That got the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, gone before it could become anything. Dominic found himself watching for it to come back, which annoyed him slightly, because he had more pressing things to think about than whether a federal investigator found him funny. "I need copies of everything here," Evelyn said, "and I'll need access to your downtown offices tomorrow. The corporate ledgers, not the hotels." "Done." He didn't blink at the request. If she wanted to dig, he'd rather she dug with his cooperation than without it. A woman who could walk unnoticed through his most guarded hallway in a housekeeping apron wasn't someone he wanted working against him in the shadows. Better to keep her where he could see her. Which was exactly what he intended to do, even as he agreed to hand her the keys to his company. After she left with the first binder tucked under her arm, promising to return the originals once she'd made copies, Dominic called his head of security into the office. Marcus had worked for him for 4 years, quiet, thorough, the kind of man who noticed a stranger's shoes before their face. "She's federal," Dominic said, before Marcus could ask. "Financial crimes. She wants full access, and I'm giving it to her." Marcus's jaw tightened, just slightly. "You're letting a federal investigator walk through everything we've got?" "I'm letting her walk through everything I know we've got," Dominic said, "which should be everything, unless one of us is lying to me. I want a full detail on her, quiet, respectful, nothing that looks like surveillance. I want to know where she stays, what time she comes and goes, if anyone talks to her who shouldn't be talking to her. She's not the threat here, Marcus. Whatever she finds is." Marcus nodded slowly, though something in his expression stayed unconvinced, like he thought his boss was making a mistake, but knew better than to say so twice. "And if she finds something that isn't clean?" Dominic hadn't let himself sit with that question yet. He'd built his empire on the idea that a man could run legitimate businesses even if the world assumed otherwise about his family name. that clean money and hard work could outlast whatever reputation had been handed down to him. He didn't like the small, cold thought that had been sitting in his chest since he read her name tag in the hallway, that somewhere in the machine he'd built, a gear might be turning that he hadn't personally checked. "Then I want to know before she does," he said. "Every account, every vendor, every shipment, I want it rechecked. Today." Marcus left to make the calls, and Dominic stood at the window a while, watching the marina below, boats rocking gently against the docks like nothing in the world had shifted that morning. But something had. He kept replaying the moment in the hallway, the way she hadn't panicked, hadn't tried to talk her way past him, hadn't done anything but tell him the plain truth once he'd caught her in it. There was something almost unnerving about a person who didn't flinch, who looked at him not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of someone used to being underestimated and using it as a tool. He thought about the way she'd said people perform for men like him. He didn't like how much that had stayed with him, how it had followed him from the hallway into this office and was apparently going to sit with him through the rest of the day. He wasn't used to being read that easily, not by federal agents, not by anyone. Whatever she found in those binders, he told himself, it wouldn't touch him. His hands were clean. He believed that the way a man believes a bridge will hold his weight, not because he's tested every plank, but because he built it himself and trusted the men who'd helped him nail it together. He was about to find out how much that trust was worth. The corporate tower stood 40 stories above the harbour, glass and steel with vein holdings etched in brushed metal across the lobby wall. Evelyn arrived at 8 sharp, and Dominic was already there waiting by the elevators, coffee in hand, a second cup held out for her before she'd even said good morning. "You didn't strike me as the type to bring coffee to the person auditing your company," she said, taking it anyway. "I didn't strike myself as that type either," Dominic admitted. "Guess we're both learning things about me today." She almost smiled again. He was starting to catalogue those almost smiles the way she catalogued numbers, small evidence collected without meaning to. Up on the 18th floor, his logistics department had cleared an entire conference room for her, stacks of files organised by quarter, laptops loaded with the transport division's full digital records. Dominic left her to it after a while, mostly because he had a company to run, and partly because he found it strange how much he wanted to stay and watch her work instead. She didn't call him back until almost noon. "I need you to look at something," Evelyn said when he walked in, and there was a different tone in her voice now, sharper, more focused. She'd spread 3 printouts across the table, columns of numbers highlighted in yellow. "Your transport accounts, specifically the regional freight contracts routed through the Homestead depot." Dominic leaned over the table, scanning the numbers. On the surface, nothing looked wrong. Shipping costs, fuel surcharges, warehouse fees, all within normal range for a company his size. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" "You're supposed to be seeing what looks normal," she said. "That's the point. Look at the vendor codes here." She tapped a column of 6-digit numbers. 3 of these vendors don't have registered business addresses, not fake addresses, no addresses at all. They exist on paper as shell entities, invoicing your logistics division for freight services that, according to your own dock logs, never happened. Dominic felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's not possible. Every invoice gets approved through Victor's office before it hits accounting." "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "That's what makes it interesting." He straightened, the coffee in his hand suddenly forgotten, going cold on the table beside the printouts. Victor had been his vice president for 3 years, brought in by his late father before Dominic had fully taken over the company, a man who'd sat across from him at 100 dinners, who'd stood beside him at his mother's funeral. The idea that Victor's signature sat on paperwork tied to phantom vendors felt less like an accusation and more like a small betrayal already happening in slow motion. "Show me the pattern," he said, pulling out a chair, sitting down across from her properly for the first time since she'd walked into his hallway the day before. Evelyn walked him through it, patient in a way he hadn't expected from someone whose job was to find guilt and prosecute it. The shell vendors had been billing small amounts each month, nothing large enough to trigger automatic review, spread across 18 months of freight invoices. Individually, each charge looked like rounding error, a few $1,000s here and there for services that could plausibly have happened. Together, the pattern added up to just over $2 million, quietly bled out of the transport division and routed, according to the wire records she'd pulled, toward an offshore account registered in the Caymans. 2 million, Dominic repeated, the number sitting strange in his mouth. Under my own signature authority, and I never saw it. You weren't meant to. Evelyn's voice softened slightly, though her eyes stayed on the numbers, still working even as she spoke to him. Whoever built this knew exactly how much scrutiny a number needs before someone like you looks twice. It's careful work, patient, somebody who understands your approval process well enough to stay just under every threshold that would have flagged it. Dominic sat with that for a long moment, running through the list of people who touched the transport ledgers before they reached him. Victor's office reviewed everything first. Victor's signature authorized every vendor addition. Victor had been the one, 3 years ago, who'd pushed hardest for expanding the Homestead freight contracts in the first place, arguing it would save the company money on regional shipping. He didn't say the name out loud. Not yet. Some part of him still wanted it to be a mistake, a coincidence, anything other than the man who'd taught him half of what he knew about running this business. I need the full trail, he said instead. Every vendor code, every wire transfer, everything you've got. You'll have it. Evelyn began gathering the printouts, sliding them into a folder with the same careful precision she'd used, sorting through his ledgers the day before. I have to be honest with you about something, Mr. Vane. My job isn't to clear you. It's to follow whatever I find, wherever it leads. If this trail comes back to you... It won't. He said it fast, firmer than he meant to, and then caught himself, softened it. It won't, because I didn't do this. But I understand you have to prove that instead of taking my word for it. I'd rather you find the truth than let me off easy because I bought you coffee. That earned him a real look this time, something searching in the way she studied his face, like she was trying to decide whether the man in front of her was genuinely as clean as he sounded, or simply better at sounding that way than most. Dominic held her gaze and let her look as long as she needed. Whatever she decided, he had his own decision already made. Somewhere inside his own company, someone had been stealing from him for 1.5 years, hiding it well enough that only a stranger in a maid's apron had been able to find it. And until he knew for certain who, he intended to trust exactly no one. Except, strangely, the federal investigator sitting across the table, still turning his own numbers against him 1 column at a time. The docks smelled like salt and diesel, cranes hoisting containers under floodlights that had just flickered on against the fading sky. Dominic brought Evelyn down himself, wanting her to see the physical side of the business, the part that didn't live in a ledger. Real ships, real cargo, real men who'd worked these piers since before he was born. This is where the freight actually moves, he said, walking her past a row of containers stacked 3 high, each one stamped with a manifest number. Everything you saw upstairs starts here or ends here. If there's a gap between what's on paper and what's in the water, we'll find it faster down here than in any spreadsheet. Evelyn had her tablet out, cross-referencing manifest numbers against the shell vendor codes from that morning, moving between rows of containers with the same quiet focus she brought to everything. Dominic watched her work and found himself, not for the first time that day, less interested in the numbers and more interested in the way she chewed the inside of her cheek when something didn't add up. Here, she said, stopping at a container near the far end of the row. This manifest number matches one of the Homestead depot invoices. According to your books, this container moved through here in March, but the dock log shows nothing scheduled under this number for that entire month. So the invoice is for a shipment that never left the ground, Dominic said, or never existed at all. Evelyn tapped something into her tablet, frowning at the screen. I'd need the physical dock records to confirm it. The digital logs could have been altered, but paper's harder to fake retroactively, especially 18 months back. Dominic pulled out his phone to call the dock supervisor for the archive room key, and that was when he saw Victor's car pull into the lot, headlights cutting across the concrete faster than the speed limit allowed. He watched his vice president get out, straightening his jacket in a way that looked less like habit and more like a man buying himself a second to compose his face. "Dominic," Victor's voice carried across the lot, a little too bright, a little too fast. "I heard you were down here. Thought I'd come see if you needed anything." "We're fine," Dominic said, watching Victor's eyes flick toward Evelyn, then toward the container behind her, then back to Dominic. Quick little movements that most people wouldn't have caught. Dominic caught them. He'd spent his whole life reading rooms full of men who didn't want to be read. "Miss Vance, right?" Victor extended a hand toward her, his smile a beat too wide. "I run operations here. If you need anything pulled from the dock office, my door's open. Happy to save you some time, walk you through whatever you're looking for." "That's kind," Evelyn said, her tone perfectly pleasant, giving nothing away. "I was actually just asking Dominic about the archive room, physical records for March shipments." Something crossed Victor's face, gone almost before it landed, but Dominic saw it. A flicker of calculation, the kind of look a man gets when he's suddenly recounting everything he might have left behind in a room he thought nobody would ever open again. "March," Victor repeated. "That's a while back. I think a lot of that got moved to off-site storage during the renovation. Might take a few days to track down." "There was a renovation?" Dominic asked, keeping his voice mild, though something in his chest had gone very still. "Small one. Office upgrades, a few months back." Victor's smile hadn't dropped, but it had gone thinner, stretched over something underneath. "I can have someone look into where the March files ended up if it's important." "It's important," Evelyn said simply. Victor nodded too quickly, said something about getting back to it first thing tomorrow, and excused himself with the kind of hurried politeness that Dominic had never once heard from him in 3 years of late-night meetings and long dinners. He watched Victor's car pull away, tail lights disappearing past the gate faster than it had come in. "You saw that," Dominic said quietly, once they were alone again between the containers. "I saw a man who didn't expect to find a federal investigator standing next to a manifest number tied to a phantom shipment," Evelyn said. "Whether that means what we both think it means, I can't say yet. Nervous isn't proof. It's something." "It's something," she agreed. "But I've learned not to build a case on somebody's face. I build it on paper. And now I want that archive room found before anyone has a chance to lose it on purpose." Dominic already had his phone out, calling the dock supervisor directly this time, bypassing Victor's office entirely, asking for anyone else who might know where old records had gone during a renovation Dominic didn't remember approving. He kept his voice steady on the call, but underneath it, something had shifted hard in his chest. The same cold drop he'd felt that morning, reading the shell vendor codes, except sharper now, closer, wearing a face he'd trusted for years. Evelyn stood beside him, watching the empty lot where Victor's car had been, her expression unreadable in the dock lights. Dominic ended the call and looked at her. "If it's him," he said, "I need to hear it from records, not from a hunch. I owe him that much, after everything. But if it's him..." "Then it's him," Evelyn finished when he didn't. "And you'll have to decide what that costs you before we even get to what it costs the company." Neither of them said anything else on the walk back to the car. The cranes kept working overhead, hauling containers through the dark, indifferent to the quiet reckoning that had just started somewhere beneath them, in a paper trail 3 years old and getting harder to hide with every hour that passed. Evelyn had rented a small corporate apartment 3 blocks from the resort, the kind of place with a doorman who barely looked up and a lease short enough that nobody would remember her name in a month. She liked it that way. Anonymity had always been part of the job, a room nobody thought to watch. She came back from a morning at the federal field office to find her door unlocked. Not broken, unlocked. The deadbolt sitting open like someone had simply walked through with a key, careful, unhurried. Her stomach tightened before her mind had even finished the thought. She pushed the door open slowly, scanning the small living room, and saw it immediately. Her laptop bag sitting open on the kitchen counter, empty. "No," she said under her breath, already moving toward the small desk by the window where she'd left her secondary drive. The backup she always kept separate from the laptop, out of habit more than anything else. It was still there, untouched, tucked behind a stack of books. Whoever had come through hadn't known to look for it, or hadn't had time. She checked the rest of the apartment, fast, methodical despite the adrenaline running through her. Nothing else was missing. No jewelry, no cash she'd left in a drawer, none of the small valuables a regular burglar would have grabbed first. Just the laptop. Just the one thing that mattered. She sat down at the desk and plugged in the backup drive, hands steadier than she felt, and pulled up the case files she'd been building since the docks. The shell vendor list, the manifest cross-references, her notes on Victor's reaction the night before, the way his eyes had moved when she'd mentioned the archive room. All of it still there, safe. But the fact that someone had come looking for it at all told her more than the files themselves. Someone inside Dominic's circle knew exactly what she'd found and exactly where she was staying. That wasn't public information. She'd told almost no one where this apartment was, not even her own office back in Washington, only logged it through a secure internal system that shouldn't have been visible outside federal channels. Which meant whoever had broken in either had access to that system or had followed her closely enough to learn the address on their own. Neither option sat well. She called it in through her direct line first, standard procedure, then sat with the phone in her lap a moment before dialing Dominic. Some small, careful part of her mind ran through the possibility that he'd known, that the coffee and the open ledgers and the easy cooperation had all been a performance leading exactly to this, a way to make her feel safe long enough to be caught off guard. She didn't want to believe it. She made herself consider it anyway, because that was the job, and she'd learned a long time ago that liking someone was never proof they were innocent. Dominic picked up on the second ring. "Someone went through my apartment," she said, no preamble. "My laptop's gone. Backup files are intact, but they got the primary machine, and they knew exactly what to take and what to leave." There was a beat of silence on the line, and then his voice came back low and controlled in a way that told her he was working hard to keep it that way. "You're safe? They're not there now?" "I'm safe. Whoever it was is long gone." "I'm sending Marcus, now." A pause, and then quieter, more careful. "You're going to ask if I knew. I didn't. I want you to hear me say that plainly because I understand exactly how it looks." "It looks like someone close to you doesn't want this investigation finished," Evelyn said. She kept her voice even, professional, even as something in her chest had gone tight and complicated in a way that had nothing to do with the case. "That someone knew where I was staying, which means they either have access they shouldn't, or they've been watching me closely enough to find out on their own." "Victor," Dominic said, and this time there was no hesitation in the name at all, no reluctance left in the way he said it. "He was at the docks last night. He saw where you got in the car. He'd have had time to have someone follow the plates." "That's a theory. I need it as fact." Evelyn stood, walking to the window, checking the street below out of old habit, though she already knew whoever had come through was long gone by now. "This changes things, Dominic. If someone's willing to break into my apartment to slow this down, they're not going to stop at a stolen laptop. I need you to understand that whatever protection you offered me on day one, I need it doubled now, and I need it in writing that it came from your own initiative, not mine, so nobody can later claim I compromised the investigation by accepting it." "You'll have it," he said. "Whatever you need. I meant what I said in that hallway, Evelyn. I built this company to be clean, and if somebody's willing to steal from a federal investigator to hide what's dirty in it, I want that person found faster than you do." She believed him. That was the part that unsettled her most. Sitting alone in her ransacked apartment with the backup drive humming quietly on the desk in front of her. Not that someone had broken in, which she'd half expected the moment she'd started pulling threads at the docks, but that the man she was supposed to be investigating had just become, without either of them quite choosing it, the person she trusted most in this entire case. Dominic chose the restaurant himself, a quiet place tucked behind a courtyard of palm trees, the kind of spot with no sign out front because the people who mattered already knew where it was. He'd booked the back room, private, No staff moving through except the one waiter he trusted enough to leave alone with a conversation like this. Evelyn arrived still rattled, though she hid it well, taking the seat across from him with the same composed stillness she'd carried since the hallway 2 days ago. He noticed the small things anyway, the way her hand stayed near her bag longer than usual, the careful glance she gave the room before sitting. "Marcus tell you anything useful?" she asked, skipping past any pleasantries. "He's pulling the security footage from your building's lobby now. Whoever went in used a keycard, not a break-in tool. That means either they had one made, or someone at the front desk let them through." Dominic kept his voice level, though the anger underneath it had been building all day, a slow burn he hadn't let himself release yet. "I want you to know I take that as a failure on my end. You're in this city because of my company. Whatever protection I offered wasn't enough, and that's on me." "It's not on you," Evelyn said, though there was an edge in it now, the professional distance she usually kept slipping just slightly. "Unless it is. I have to ask you plainly, Dominic. Did anyone in your circle know where I was staying before last night?" "Only Marcus. He handles logistics for anyone I'm working with." Dominic held her gaze, steady, refusing to look away from the accusation sitting underneath her question. "I didn't tell Victor. I didn't tell anyone else. If someone found you, they found you on their own, which means either Marcus has a leak in his own team, or somebody followed you from the docks like you already suspected." "That's what I need to believe," Evelyn said quietly. "I need to believe it, because the alternative is that everything since that hallway has been staged for my benefit, and I don't know how to reconcile that with what I've actually seen from you the last 2 days." The admission cost her something to say, he could tell, and it cost him something to hear it, a strange ache settling in his chest that had nothing to do with the investigation and everything to do with the fact that she'd just told him, plainly, that some part of her wanted to trust him and didn't know if she was allowed to. "I swear on my mother's name," Dominic said, low and certain. "I had no part in what happened to you last night. I've spent 6 years trying to build something in this city that doesn't carry my father's shadow with it. If I let something happen to a federal investigator inside my own operation, everything I've built means nothing. I need this cleared as much as you do. More, maybe, because it's my name on the door." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that felt like it was measuring something deeper than his words, weighing 6 years of a reputation against 2 days of watching him hand over ledgers without flinching. Whatever she found in that look seemed to settle something in her, because her shoulders dropped slightly, the tension she'd carried in from the apartment easing just a fraction. "Then help me finish this fast," she said. "The longer this drags, the more chances Victor, or whoever it is, has to cover their tracks completely. I need the archive room found, I need doc records from March, and I need to know I'm not walking back into another apartment tonight with someone waiting to make sure I don't finish what I started." "You're not going back to that apartment," Dominic said. "Not tonight, not until this is settled. I have a property near the water, secured, staffed by people who've worked for me since before Victor ever set foot in this company. You'll have your own floor. Nobody gets near you without going through people I trust with my life." "That's a significant thing to offer someone investigating you," Evelyn said, though there was less resistance in it than there might have been 2 days earlier. "It's not an offer to you," Dominic said. "It's an offer to whoever's willing to hurt you to protect themselves. I want them to know exactly how far I'm willing to go to make sure they don't get another chance." Something passed between them then, unspoken, neither of them naming it directly, though Dominic felt it settle into the space between them like a decision already half made. He'd started this week certain of very little beyond his own numbers and his own name. Now he found himself certain of something else entirely. That whatever this woman uncovered about his company, he wanted her safe more than he wanted to be cleared, and that the two things had somehow, without his permission, stopped feeling separate at all. Evelyn didn't argue further about the safe house. She simply nodded, finished the last of her water, and let the silence between them carry the rest of what neither of them was ready to say out loud yet. Not with an embezzler still loose somewhere in his company, and a stolen laptop sitting in someone's hands, waiting to tell them exactly how much more damage that person was willing to do before this was over. The regional bank sat on a quiet street away from the coastal traffic, an old building with thick stone walls and a vault that had been storing corporate records for Vane Holdings since before Dominic's father took over the company. Dominic hadn't been down to this branch in years. Most of what he needed lived in digital systems now, but paper, as Evelyn kept reminding him, was harder to fake retroactively. The bank manager led them down a narrow staircase to the vault level, unlocked a long metal door, and left them alone in a records room lined with document boxes going back 2 decades. Dominic pulled the boxes marked with the transport division's account numbers while Evelyn set up at a small table, her tablet beside her for cross-referencing. "March," she said, and he handed her the box. They worked in near silence for the first stretch, Dominic sorting through folders while Evelyn compared each signed authorization against the digital copies she'd already pulled from the corporate system. He found himself watching her hands more than the papers in his own, the careful, unhurried way she moved through documents that could end a man's freedom or clear his name, depending on what they said. "Here," Evelyn said eventually, sliding a folder across the table. "Vendor authorization for the Homestead Depot expansion, dated 14 months ago. This is the signature that approved adding the 3 shell vendors to the active vendor list." Dominic looked down at the page. His own signature sat at the bottom, familiar, the same loop on the D he'd been writing since he was a teenager, learning to sign contracts at his father's side. "That's mine," he said, and something cold moved through him, faster than before, because if this was real, if he really had signed off on the vendors himself. "Look closer," Evelyn said, and there was something careful in her voice, like she already knew what she was about to show him and wanted to soften the ground before it hit. She pulled a second document from her folder, an older signature of his from a contract 3 years back, and set it beside the vault copy. "The pressure's different. See how the D curves here, on the older one? It comes up sharp at the top before it drops. On this one, it's smooth the whole way through. And your T crossbar, you always cross low, close to the middle of the stem. This one crosses high." Dominic stared at the 2 signatures side by side, and the longer he looked, the more the difference stood out. Subtle, but undeniable once she'd pointed it out. Like a face he knew well, suddenly wearing an expression he'd never seen it make. "It's not mine," he said quietly. "It's not yours," Evelyn confirmed. "It's a good forgery. Someone studied your signature closely, probably from years of watching you sign contracts in front of them. But a forgery holds its shape too carefully. A real signature has small, natural variation every time. This one's almost too consistent, like it was traced or practiced from a single reference copy." Dominic sat back, the weight of it settling into his chest slower than he expected. Heavier, too. "Victor sat beside me for 3 years while I signed 100 contracts. He'd have seen my hand 1,000 times." "He would have," Evelyn agreed. "And whoever forged this knew exactly which document to place it on. Buried inside a routine vendor expansion nobody would think twice about approving. That's not opportunistic. That's planned, probably from the very beginning of the shell vendor scheme." They spent the next hour pulling every document tied to the 3 shell vendors, and the pattern that emerged was worse than Dominic had let himself imagine. 14 separate authorizations across 18 months, each one bearing the same careful forgery of his signature, each one routed through Victor's office before reaching the vault for archiving. The trail was clean in the worst way, clean enough that Dominic himself had never once questioned it, clean enough that it had taken a federal investigator in a housekeeping apron to find the seam. "I trusted him with everything," Dominic said, more to himself than to her, staring at the stack of forged documents spread across the table. "My father trusted him before that. He sat at my mother's funeral. He taught me half of what I know about running freight contracts." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, watching him with something that had softened past professional distance, something closer to genuine sympathy. "I've seen this before. Not this exact case, but this exact feeling. The people closest to the money are almost always the ones with the clearest path to stealing it. It's not a reflection on your judgment, Dominic. It's a reflection on how patient he was willing to be. $2 million over 18 months, Dominic said. That's not desperation. That's a plan. That's a plan, she agreed, which means he's not going to stop just because we found the vault copies. If he's smart enough to build this slowly, he's smart enough to have a plan for getting caught, too. We need to move before he realizes how close we are. Dominic gathered the forged documents into a folder himself, his hands steady now in a way that surprised him, the shock of the last hour settling into something harder, colder, more useful. Whatever grief he felt about Victor could wait. Right now, there was a company to protect, and a man still walking free inside it, and Dominic intended to make sure that didn't last much longer. "Where does this trail lead next?" he asked. "Wherever the money went after it left your accounts," Evelyn said, already packing the folders into her bag. "Offshore accounts don't spend themselves, Dominic. Somewhere out there, Victor's been moving that money into something real. I want to find it before he has a reason to move it again." Evelyn traced the offshore transfers back through 3 shell accounts before the money finally settled somewhere solid. A wire transfer 6 months old that had paid, in full, for a private warehouse lease on the industrial edge of Hialeah. No company name attached, just a personal holding entity registered under an address that turned out to be a mailbox rental 2 towns over. "This is where it lands," she told Dominic that morning, showing him the address on her tablet. "Whatever he's been doing with the money, he's been doing it here." Dominic didn't call Marcus this time. He didn't want word reaching anyone in the company before he and Evelyn had eyes on the place themselves, not with a leak still unaccounted for somewhere in his circle. He drove them out himself, an unmarked car, nothing that would draw attention on a street lined with corrugated warehouses and chain-link fences. The building sat at the far end of the block, unmarked, a plain metal door with a keypad lock that looked newer than the rest of the structure. No cameras that Dominic could see, no signage, nothing to suggest it belonged to anyone at all. "I can get us in," Evelyn said, already pulling a small device from her bag, something that looked like a phone but clearly wasn't. "But once we're through that door, whatever's inside becomes evidence I have to log properly. If it's what I think it is, we do this by the book from here, or none of it holds up later." "Understood," Dominic said, and meant it. Whatever satisfaction he might have wanted in confronting Victor himself, he understood by now that Evelyn's careful, methodical approach was the only version of this that actually ended with Victor in a courtroom, instead of walking free on a technicality. The keypad gave way faster than Dominic expected, and the door swung open onto a space that looked, at first glance, almost disappointingly ordinary. Metal shelving units, a few stacked pallets, fluorescent lights that flickered on with a low hum when Evelyn found the switch. But past the first row of shelves, the space opened into something else entirely. A small server room, cool air pumped in through a dedicated unit, 3 racks of hardware humming quietly in the dark. "There," Evelyn said, moving toward it fast, her earlier caution replaced by something sharper, more urgent. "This isn't storage. This is where he's been running everything. A private server off the corporate network, completely separate from anything your IT department would ever see." She pulled a small drive from her bag and knelt in front of the main rack, working quickly, her fingers moving over the terminal with practiced speed. Dominic stood watch near the door, though he found himself drawn back toward her every few seconds, unable to fully focus on the entrance while she worked. "I'm in," she said after a few minutes, and the relief in her voice was quiet but real. "He's been logging everything here. Vendor creation records, wire authorizations, even the signature template he used to build the forgeries. He scanned an old contract of yours years ago and's been tracing from it ever since." Dominic crossed the room to look over her shoulder at the screen, rows of files organized with a precision that felt almost insulting, like Victor had taken pride in how carefully he'd hidden it all. $2 million, and he kept a filing system for it. "People always keep records," Evelyn said, "even criminals, especially patient ones. They think organization protects them. Really, it just gives us a map." She pulled a second drive, mirroring the server's contents, careful to preserve the chain of evidence exactly as her training required. This is enough. This is more than enough. Once this gets into federal hands, there's no version of this where Victor talks his way out of it. Dominic felt something in his chest ease for the first time in 5 days, a tightness he hadn't fully noticed until it started to loosen. His name was clear. His company was clear. Whatever came next belonged entirely to Victor and the choices he'd made alone. "We should go," Evelyn said, closing the drive case and standing. "I want this evidence secured in federal custody before anyone realizes we found this place." They were halfway back toward the door when Dominic's phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Marcus, short and urgent. Victor left the office 10 minutes ago, didn't say where, took his laptop and the executive suite master key. Dominic's stomach dropped. "He's heading somewhere. Marcus says he took the master key to the executive suite." Evelyn's face went still, the calm calculation she usually wore replaced for just a moment by something closer to alarm. "The mainframe for the resort's central servers runs through that suite. If he thinks we're closing in..." "He'll wipe everything he can reach," Dominic finished, already moving toward the car, "including whatever's left on the main system that we haven't pulled copies of yet." They ran the last stretch to the car together, the warehouse door left open behind them, evidence secured, but the larger fight suddenly, urgently, not yet finished. Dominic drove faster than he should have back toward the resort, Evelyn beside him gripping the evidence case tight against her chest. Both of them silent, both of them thinking the same thing without needing to say it out loud. That whatever quiet, careful investigation they'd been running for 4 days was about to turn, in the space of 20 minutes, into something neither of them could fully control anymore. The drive back felt longer than it was, every red light stretching past patience, Dominic's hands tight on the wheel while Evelyn worked her phone, alerting her field office, requesting backup that wouldn't arrive in time to matter for whatever happened in the next 20 minutes. By the time they reached the resort, the sun had dropped low over the marina, casting long shadows across the lobby as Dominic pushed through the front doors with Evelyn close behind him. The executive suite sat on the top floor, past the vault corridor where all of this had started 5 days earlier. Dominic took the private elevator 2 at a time in his head, willing it to move faster, and when the doors finally opened, he could see light spilling from under the suite's door at the end of the hall. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and found Victor exactly where he'd feared, standing at the small server terminal tucked into the suite's back office, one hand hovering over a red switch mounted beneath the main console, the emergency wipe, installed years ago as a failsafe against hackers, something Dominic himself had approved and forgotten about until this exact moment. "Don't," Dominic said, low and hard, stepping into the room. Victor turned, and for a second the man Dominic had known for 3 years looked almost relieved to be caught, like he'd been standing there working up the nerve to press the switch, and some part of him had been hoping someone would stop him before he had to. The look didn't last. It hardened fast into something colder, more desperate. "You don't understand what you're about to do to this family," Victor said, his voice cracking slightly. "That switch is the only thing standing between me and prison, Dominic. You'd choose her over 3 years of loyalty." "Loyalty," Dominic repeated, and something in the word came out almost like disgust. "You forged my signature. You stole from my father's company, from the people who work these docks, from the family you're standing there talking to me about. Don't you dare call this loyalty." Victor's hand twitched toward the switch, and Dominic moved fast, crossing the room and putting his body directly between Victor and the console, close enough now that he could see the sweat on Victor's face, the tremor in his hand. "You press that switch, you're not saving yourself. You're proving to every federal agent in this city that you had something worth destroying. Is that really the play you want to make right now?" "Get out of the way, Dominic." Victor's voice had gone thin, stretched, a man cornered and running out of room to think clearly. "No." Dominic didn't move. Behind him, he could hear Evelyn's footsteps, quick and quiet, moving around the far side of the desk toward a second terminal he hadn't even noticed, one that controlled the digital logs directly. "I'm locking down the servers now," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the tension thick enough to choke on in the small room. Victor, whatever you're thinking of doing to that switch, understand that I've already pulled duplicate copies of everything from the Hialeah warehouse. Wiping this system doesn't erase your crime, it only adds obstruction to the list. Something in Victor's face crumpled at that, the fight draining out of him in slow stages, like a man finally hearing, out loud, how thoroughly the walls had already closed around him. His hand fell away from the switch, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at Dominic with an expression that carried more grief than anger. "I did it for my daughter," Victor said quietly. "You have no idea what it costs, Dominic. I told myself I'd pay it back once things stabilized. I told myself that for 1.5 years. Dominic felt something twist in his chest, some old, complicated mix of anger and pity that he didn't have time to sort through properly, not standing in a room that had almost lost every piece of evidence they'd spent 5 days gathering. "You could have come to me," he said, quieter now. "I'd have helped you. You know I'd have helped you, Victor. You didn't have to steal from people who trusted you to ask instead." "Pride," Victor said, and it sounded like the truest thing he'd said all week. "I didn't want to be the man who needed saving. I wanted to fix it myself." Evelyn finished securing the terminal, the servers locked down, evidence preserved, and looked up at both of them with the quiet, exhausted authority of someone who'd just watched a case close in real time. "Victor Reyes, I need you to step away from the console and sit down. You're not under arrest yet, but federal agents will be here within the hour, and anything you do between now and then only makes your position worse." Victor sat, slowly, all the fight gone out of him, staring at the floor, while Dominic stood there, watching a man he'd trusted for 3 years fold in on himself completely. There was no relief in it, not the way Dominic had expected relief to feel, just a tired, hollow ache, and underneath it, gratitude that the woman standing across the room had walked into his hallway in a housekeeping apron 5 days ago and refused to let any of this stay buried. "It's over," Evelyn said quietly, mostly to Dominic, her hand briefly finding his arm before she caught herself and stepped back into something more professional. "The evidence is secured. Your company's clean. Whatever comes next belongs to him now, not you." Dominic nodded, though his eyes stayed on Victor a moment longer, on the daughter he'd mentioned, desperate choices that had brought all 4 of them to this room. He didn't feel like celebrating. He just felt, for the first time in 5 days, like he could finally breathe. Federal agents arrived at the resort within the hour, just as Evelyn had promised, and Victor went with them quietly. No cuffs in front of the staff, no scene in the lobby. Dominic had asked for that much, and the lead agent, recognizing the weight of what Evelyn's report would say about Vane Holdings' cooperation, had allowed it. Victor walked out through the service entrance instead, past the same corridor where Dominic had first mistaken Evelyn for lost housekeeping 5 days earlier, and neither of them said anything as he passed. By morning, Dominic sat in a small federal office downtown, in a conference room with grey walls and a table too long for the 4 people seated around it. Evelyn sat across from him, back in a plain blazer, though this time it wasn't a costume, just her own clothes, her own posture, none of the careful performance she'd carried through the resort that first day. 2 of her superiors sat beside her, reviewing the file she'd spent the night compiling. "Special Investigator Vance's report is thorough," the older of the 2 agents said, flipping through pages thick with printouts, wire transfer records, the forged signature comparisons laid out side by side. "Mr. Vane, I want to be direct with you. When this investigation opened, your name sat at the top of our list of persons of interest. Your father's history made that unavoidable." Dominic nodded, no defensiveness in it, just quiet acknowledgement of a reality he'd lived with his whole adult life. "I understand. I've spent 6 years trying to build something that doesn't carry that weight." "I'm glad the numbers finally speak for themselves instead of the name." "They do," the agent said. "Every transfer traces back to Victor Reyes alone. Forged authorizations, a private server outside your corporate network, a shell company registered under an address that has nothing to do with you or your holdings. Ms. Vance's report formally clears Vane Holdings of any criminal financial conduct. You're free of this. Something loosened in Dominic's chest, a tension he hadn't fully let himself name until it started to leave. He looked at Evelyn, and she met his eyes with something quiet and steady. Not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like one. There's something else, Evelyn said, turning a page in her own copy of the file, addressing her superiors now rather than Dominic. During the course of this investigation, cooperation from Mr. Vane went well beyond what's typically required or expected. He granted unrestricted access to every system, every record, every physical location tied to his company, without a single request for delay or legal obstruction. That cooperation is the reason this case closed in 5 days instead of 5 months. The younger agent made a note, glancing between Evelyn and Dominic with something like mild curiosity, the kind of look that noticed things without needing to comment on them directly. That'll go in the file as well. It matters for what it's worth, especially given the family history you mentioned. They spent another hour going over details, formal statements, timelines confirmed against the physical evidence pulled from the warehouse and the bank vault. Victor, Dominic learned, had already begun cooperating with prosecutors, offering full details of the scheme in exchange for consideration on his daughter's behalf, a plea arrangement that would likely keep him out of the harshest sentencing while still holding him accountable for what he'd taken. Dominic felt no satisfaction in hearing that, only a tired, complicated relief. When the meeting finally ended, Dominic lingered in the hallway outside the conference room while Evelyn finished a last conversation with her superiors. He watched through the glass as she spoke, calm and composed, the same steady presence she'd carried since the moment he'd read her name tag in his own hallway. It was strange, he thought, how much had changed in 5 days, how a woman who'd walked into his life as a threat to everything he'd built had ended up being the reason it was still standing. She came out a few minutes later, a folder tucked under her arm, and found him waiting by the elevator. "It's really over," she said, and there was something different in her voice now, lighter, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying the entire week. "It's over," Dominic agreed. "What happens to you now? Back to Washington? Another company? Another apron somewhere?" Evelyn hesitated, longer than the question probably warranted, and Dominic found himself watching her closely, waiting. "I have paperwork to finish, a formal case closure. After that, I'm not entirely sure." This one was different. Most cases end with a company in ruins and a name in the news. This one ended with the truth actually protecting the person I thought I might be building a case against. "Is that a professional observation?" Dominic asked. "Or something else?" She looked at him then, really looked, the same searching gaze she'd given him that first afternoon in his office, except softer now, less guarded. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I'd like to find out, if you're willing to let me." Dominic felt something in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel clearly all week, something that had been building quietly underneath every ledger, every drive back from the docks, every moment she'd trusted him with a piece of the investigation she didn't have to share. He wasn't sure yet what to call it either, only that he wanted the chance to find out too, and that whatever came next between them, he wanted it to start somewhere far away from warrants and shell vendors and the weight of everything they'd both been carrying since that first morning in the hallway. "I'm willing," he said, "whenever you're ready." The marina was quiet that afternoon, the kind of stillness that only came after a week like the one they'd both just lived through. Dominic stood near the end of the dock beside his boat, the Marguerite, named for his mother, watching the water shift gold under the late sun. He'd told Marcus to keep everyone else away for a few hours. Whatever happened here, he wanted it to happen without an audience. Evelyn arrived on foot, a slim folder in her hand, dressed simply, none of the careful armor she'd worn through most of the week. She looked lighter somehow, like the case had been a weight sitting on her shoulders and she'd only just set it down for good. "You actually came in something other than a blazer," Dominic said as she reached him. "I don't have a case anymore," she said, Turns out I own other clothes." He smiled, the first easy smile he'd let himself have in days, and gestured toward 2 chairs set up near the edge of the dock, a small table between them with 2 glasses of iced tea neither of them would probably touch. She sat, setting the folder down carefully. "This is the official clearance paperwork," she said. "Vane Holdings, fully exonerated. Signed, stamped, filed this morning. Victor's case moves forward separately. Nothing left connecting your company to any of it." Dominic took the folder, flipping it open just enough to see his own company's name printed clean beside the word cleared, something he hadn't fully believed he'd get to see a week ago. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for this, for actually looking, instead of assuming you already knew what my father's name meant about me." "I don't work off assumptions," Evelyn said. "I work off paper." "Yours happened to tell the truth." She paused, folding her hands in her lap, something more personal settling into her expression now that the professional part of the conversation had finished. "I also handed in my resignation this morning." Dominic looked up, surprised despite the conversation they'd started in the hallway outside the conference room the day before. "From the Federal Task Force? Evelyn, that's your career." "It was my career," she said. "Conflict of interest rules are strict for a reason. I can't finish investigations fairly if I'm sitting across the table from someone I—" She stopped, searching for the right word, something that wouldn't oversell what was still new and untested between them, but also wouldn't undersell it either. "Someone I've come to trust the way I trusted you by the end of this week. I couldn't keep doing this job honestly and also want what I think I'm starting to want, so I chose." "That's a big thing to give up," Dominic said quietly. "It is." She met his eyes, steady despite the admission. "I've spent 8 years finding the rot in other people's companies. I'm good at it. But I've never once, in 8 years, found someone worth staying for on the other side of a case file. I wasn't going to walk away from that just to keep a job I could always find somewhere else." Dominic sat with that a long moment, the water lapping quietly against the dock, gulls calling somewhere further out over the bay. He thought about the offer he'd been turning over in his mind since the night in Coral Gables, the one he hadn't been sure he had the right to make until this exact moment. "I want to offer you something," he said. "Not because of anything between us. Before that, separate from it. Head of Financial Ethics, a new position, reporting directly to me, full authority to audit any part of my company at any time, no notice required." Victor built his scheme by exploiting the fact that nobody was watching closely enough. "I don't want that gap to exist again. I want someone in that seat who's already proven she won't look away from something just because it's inconvenient." Evelyn's eyebrows lifted slightly, genuine surprise crossing her face for the first time all week. "You're offering me a job auditing you, after I spent 5 days investigating you for fraud?" "I'm offering you a job auditing everyone who works for me," Dominic said, "including me, especially me, because apparently I need someone in the building who notices things I don't. You found what an entire internal accounting department missed for 18 months. I'd be a fool not to want that permanently on my side." "And the other thing," Evelyn said carefully, "whatever's happening between us, does that complicate the job offer?" "Probably," Dominic admitted, and there was something almost boyish in the honesty of it, a rare crack in the composed man who'd built an empire out of his father's shadow. "But I'd rather have both complications in my life than either one missing from it. I'm not asking you to choose between the job and whatever this is. I'm asking if you'll let both things be true at the same time." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, looking out at the boats rocking gently in their slips, the sun sitting low and warm over the water. When she looked back at him, there was something settled in her expression, decided, the same calm certainty she'd carried into his hallway 7 days ago, wearing a housekeeping apron and a name tag that had changed both their lives. "I'll take the job," she said, "and I'd like to see where the other thing goes too. Slowly, honestly. No forged signatures, no hidden servers, nothing either of us has to dig for later." "Slowly," Dominic agreed, reaching across the small table to take her hand, the first time either of them had let themselves do something that simple without a case file sitting between them. Honestly, that's a deal I can sign my real name to. Evelyn laughed, quiet and genuine, the sound carrying out over the water as the sun dropped lower behind the marina, and for the first time since a chubby woman in an apron had stood calmly under his hand in a restricted hallway, Dominic Vane felt like the ground beneath him was finally, completely solid.